There are 5 occasions in Pauline literature in which the author claims to write in their own hand. The first 3 come in the greeting alone. So these are 1 Corinthians 16:21, Colossians 4:18, 2 Thessalonians 3:17. In each one of these, the author says the greeting is in the hand of Paul, and presumably only the greeting. On the 2 other occasions, namely Galatians 6:11 and Philemon 19, the greeting alone is not in the author's hand. We can presume that more is written in Paul's hand in these 2 instances than just the greeting. But the question is, how much more is written in Paul's own hand? Does Paul write the rest of the letter in his own hand? Does he start earlier than his hand is mentioned? Or is it perhaps the case that the entire letter is written in his own hand? In this presentation, I'm going to argue that Philemon was in fact written in Paul's own hand. And this is not an incredibly hot take. For some time in the history of scholarship, this was in fact a very common assumption, but that has not been the case so much in modern scholarship. So sort of in the history of interpretation, this claim that Philemon is entirely written in Paul's own hand crops up fairly often, but it is not the assumption now in modern New Testament scholarship. Rather, the assumption is that Paul probably writes a portion of the document in his own hand, perhaps picking up the pen at the place where he says, "I write in my own hand, I will repay," and then continues on the rest of this letter in his own hand. I am going to argue in contrast that from the very beginning of Philemon to the very end of Philemon, the entire thing, at least one of the drafts of it, was first written in Paul's own hand. And the primary way that I'm going to make this argument is by comparing Philemon, and particularly Philemon 19, to a genre of text from Paul's context called cheirographs. And we're going to look at a number of papyri cheirographs from Paul's context, largely from the 1st century CE, but also sort of on either side of the 1st century CE as well. And what cheirographs are is a chirograph literally means handwriting. Cheir and graph, the 2 parts of our word chirograph there, meaning handwriting. And what cheirographs are is that they are a sort of receipt-like document. They're a financial guarantee that were very, very popular beginning in the 2nd century BCE and sort of moving all the way up through the Byzantine period. And what they did is they confirmed various kinds of financial proceedings. The most common kind of financial proceeding that they recorded was the reception of a loan. Someone saying, "I received this money, and this is the guarantee that I received the money, I will pay it back, and if I need to, I will pay interest." So like other genres in any context, chirographs have fixed and flexible features to them. That is, there are certain things that make them identifiable as a chirograph. And what's interesting about chirographs is that they take the form of letters, as did many other kinds of documents in the 1st century context. That the sort of the letter container became a very popular way to fill in many different kinds of documents, and chirographs were one of those. So they sort of borrowed features from the letter writing genre, including beginning with the names, namely the name of the person receiving the funds or the goods in the nominative case, and then oftentimes their parents or grandparents indicated in the genitive case. So Nick, son of Ken, in the genitive, and then the name of the person remitting the funds, usually in the dative case. So from Nick to Beth, or something like this, in the nominative and the dative, just as we would expect to find with papyri letters in the ancient world. And just as also we would expect to find with papyri letters in the ancient world, the names are followed by a greeting. Almost by rule, almost always the simple greeting cheirein, just greetings or hello. Following cheirein, the greeting, there is a confirmation of the reception of whatever goods or whatever funds the person was receiving, that they state, "I received whatever it is that I received." Then they guarantee that they will repay that amount, or they will repay the goods that they got with a certain amount of money. And if they don't, they guarantee that they will repay the interest. So if I don't pay by this amount of time, I will pay this much interest on the money or on the goods that I received. And then following the statement of the repayment of interest, we have what is most important for our purposes, the validation statement, where the person validates the document. followed by oftentimes the date. And this is one reason that chirographs are so helpful for our context, is we can know precisely when each document was written because they were recording financial proceedings. It was important that the specific day and year that they were written be recorded in the document itself. So to give us a really, really great example of a papyri chirograph, and this particular document is quickly becoming one of my favorite papyrus documents from antiquity. This is Papyri Oxyrhynchus 33, 2677, and it's an undated chirograph, and there's a very good reason that it is undated, but its features align with what we find in chirographs in Paul's context. So it very well could be from the 1st century or maybe the 2nd century CE. Just to sort of be safe, I'm going to say it's probably 2nd century CE, but very close to Paul's context. Its original editor, it was in 1968, P.J. Parsons, and the text from this one and from all of the papyri documents that we're going to be looking at are going to come from the Duke database for documentary papyri, and all of the translations in these documents are going to be my own translation. So what this particular document is it's a sort of plug and play chirograph. It's a template for how one might fill out a chirograph or how one might complete a chirograph in the ancient world. So it sort of presents a gold standard for the genre. So you see someone, son of someone whose mother is someone from somewhere. So all those someones get filled in with the actual information of the chirograph. And then we have to someone. So we have our names here. We have the greetings. Then we have the I admit to having received from a hand in the registry such and such an amount of money. You fill in that such and such there, which totals such and such an amount, which I'll repay as soon as you make the request. If I don't, I will pay in full accordance with the deposit law. That is to say, I will pay the interest, whatever the interest is, from all of my property and everything that I have. And then what's most important for our purposes here is going to be the validation statement. The hand, which is mine, the autograph of so-and-so written twice over, is validation of receipt in whatever place this document is brought and to anyone you might bring it. So to sort of pull this validation statement out, this is what it looks like. And this is going to be our comparanda for Philemon 19. But before we move to Philemon 19, I want to show you how this particular validation statement, or this sort of form of the validation statement, gets used in other papyri texts, so that we see this particular form repeated exactly with names filled in, and also modulated slightly in different texts from the period. But sort of noteworthy about the validation formula here itself, we have a verbless sentence, so no verb here. We have a nominative and a predicate, so a predicate sentence here. And hand has several modifiers. So if we look over here at the particular hand, its modifiers are going to be being mine, an ideograph, that is to say an autograph written twice over. So in the validation formula, we have sort of a claim that the hand belongs to the writer, and then the writer's name, and we also have the word ideograph or autograph used. And this is going to be particularly important, and this is going to be a feature that is repeated. So we see this in this papyri document from 186 CE. Again, the hand is validation, and again, my autographic hand. So we get that ideograph in there, sort of an emphasis on the writer's autograph, that it is the person writing the document is the same person writing the validation statement. Similarly, in this other chirograph from 145 BCE, we have this chirograph is my autograph written twice. So once again, a claim to the autograph here. And both of these texts, what they do is they guarantee the document with that term autograph or ideograph in Greek there. They both use a first person possessive. In this case, in one case, a possessive pronoun, in the other case, a possessive adjective. And what's notable about these documents is both of them do not have a second hand. So the entire document is written in one hand, namely the hand of the person receiving the funds. So we have a document written in one hand and the person declaring that this document is written in my own hand. And on the second chirograph here, we have this claim at the end, which is a bit unique to this particular chirograph, that the document stands and it's sort of just as official as if it were a document that was registered in a public tax office or registered in a public scribal office. And this is what made chirographs a really popular genre in the ancient world, is that they became really, really convenient. Rather than having to go and go to an official place to register a confirmation of receipt, you could just write it up in your own hand, and you could sort of enter into this contract by using your own handwriting. And your handwriting served as your sort of own guarantee. And so what happens then is that if the validation statement states that the debtor wrote in their own hand, if ideograph is used, or if it said this sort of, this hand is mine, that of so-and-so, when there's an emphasis on the autograph or the individual person's hand, very logically and as a rule, there is not a second hand in the document, that the entire document is written in one single hand. To show you these different documents, and to show you that they are written in the same hand, and just because looking at papyrus documents is always very fun. Here is the first one. You can see written in one single hand. Here's the second one, a little bit harder to see, and it looks at the bottom that the hand has changed. I promise it has not. It appears as though the person writing in this case, Titus, is sort of getting not rushed at the end, but is getting a little bit cramped, and their hand sort of changes at the bottom. But when you look at the individual letters and ligatures, that they are actually the same hand as what comes earlier. It just appears that the person gets rushed or cramped a little bit at the bottom there. And so these two examples are what we would call holographic chirographs. So we have a lot of graphs here. Remember, graph meaning writing, of course. Hola is meaning holy, so holy written in the case of holographic. Chirograph, handwriting, so holy written handwriting. A holographic chirograph is a chirograph that is written entirely in the debtor's hand. There's not a second hand, there's only one hand, the person saying they've received these loans. But this was not the only kind of chirograph in the ancient context. We also find examples of what are called allographic chirographs, so other written handwritings. That is, other written being written by someone else handwritings. And so what we have when we have allographic chirographs, what happens is that we get the document proper, and then under the document, sort of on the same document or on the same piece of papyrus, we get an abbreviated account of what comes above it. So we get sort of all of those features of the genre, and then under it, an abbreviated account of the transaction, always in a second hand. So a scribe writes up the first part, and then there's a hypograph underneath it that is sometimes actually in the debtor's own hand. If they didn't have time to write up the whole chirograph, they would write up the very abbreviated 2 sentences or so. But that's not the normal way of doing things. Usually the hypograph is written in another hand that does not belong to the debtor. And the reason that there is a hypograph, and a reason that the person did not write the entire document in their own hand, is precisely because they could not write. They were grapho illiterate. They did not have the ability to write whatsoever. So what we find in some of these allographic chirographs is that we have both the validation statements still there as part and parcel of the genre. The hand is validation in the chirograph proper, in the sort of top portion of the document. And then under the document, in the hypograph written by someone else, we will have an illiteracy formula saying, I wrote for this person, the person that's named in the document itself, because they're illiterate or because they don't no letters. So one example of this from P.Oxy 264, dated right around to the time Paul is writing, 54 CE, and another from the 1st century BCE. So in both of these cases, we have the validation statement saying that the hand is valid wherever the document is taken, in the case of the second chirograph here, and also the illiteracy formula saying who wrote for the individual person. And so the person writing for the person named in the document is essentially putting themselves out there and vouching for that person. So it's not the scribe who writes up the document that writes up the hypograph. It's someone that the illiterate person brings along and says, I need you to guarantee this for me because I cannot write the guarantee in my own hand. I need to borrow your hand, and your hand serves as a guarantee for me. So what happens with these allographic chirographs, or what happens with these chirographs that have illiteracy formulas, they have hypographs and illiteracy formulas, they are by rule, in the validation statement, by rule, they do not emphasize the autograph or the name of the person in the validation statement. So notice in these two examples here, we don't have the name of the person in the validation statement. We don't have any reference to their ideograph or autograph. Rather, it's just saying the hand is validation, but it's not the individual person's hand. So that person is not mentioned in the validation statement by rule because it is not their hand validating the document. And so we get sort of ways that this whole thing gets modulated, this practice of having other people sign or write up the document for another person. And a really good example of this is P.Oxy 493487, also firmly dated in the middle of the 1st century. And in this case, a woman named Thesaurius is illiterate, and she receives partial repayment of a loan. Someone has given her back part of the money, and she's confirming that she has received that money. There's an individual who is her so-called custodian, her kurios, her custodian or lord, maybe her father. And this person is mentioned in the document at the beginning, sort of in where the names are mentioned in the contract or in the chirograph. Kephilos is mentioned as Thesaurius's custodian. And then the hand is validated after it sort of confirms the reception of the money with the phrase kuria he ker, the hand is validation. Not Thesaurius's hand, she doesn't write because she's illiterate. It's also not Kephilus's hand, he's not writing for her, but he's mentioned as her custodian, sort of overseeing the financial proceedings. So the person that writes the document is Zoilus, or he writes the hypograph. So we have a scribe that writes the document proper. We don't know the scribe's name. And then a hypograph that is written for Thesaurius by this man named Zoilos, son of Horus. So he writes for Thesaurius. Kephilos does not write for Thesaurius, but then under the hypograph, the kurios is always supposed to also sign on to the document. And so, and Kephilos does do this. So under the hypograph that's written by Zoilos, we have Kephilos endorsing the document. So endorsements usually were just a sentence long and sometimes even just a handful of words. And Kephilos endorses this document, but he does so in a really awkward and slow hand. Kephilos is a slow writer. He's not able to write fluently. So you look at the image here and you can sort of see, it should maybe stand out to you where Kephilos writes his portion. It's the much larger portion towards the bottom here. And it simply says, Kephilos epigrammai kurios. Kephilos endorses the Lord, or Kephilos, her custodian, endorses presumably this document. So the situation, as I've sort of, to simplify it here and to recap, is that the scribe writes the document for the woman Thesaurius, and Kephilos serves as the custodian. He's named as the custodian. Thesaurius is not able to write the entire document herself because she's illiterate, so Zoilos writes a hypograph, sort of vouches for her, but Zoilos does not write a hypograph for Kephilos. Rather, Kephilos writes his endorsement on his own with the simple 3 words, but he does it very painfully and slowly. The point here is that his signature matters. It's still a representation of himself, and it's preferred that actually probably that he sign it, even if he does it really slowly, painfully, and inelegantly. So Kephilos could have had someone else write for him. He could have had someone else write a hypograph for him. It couldn't have been Zoilus. It would have had to have been someone else. You would have had to have a second person vouching. You can't have the same person vouching for two people. But for whatever reason, Kephilos does not have someone write for him. He either as a point of pride, perhaps, that he wants to show that he can write, or because maybe it was more convenient. He couldn't find someone else to more elegantly and more quickly write up his portion for him. Similarly, we can have cases where there are multiple people and nobody writes in their own hand. So multiple people mentioned in a contract, multiple sort of signatures or hypographs, and none of the signatures belonging to the persons that are mentioned in the contract. And there's a case of this in P.Oxy 2267 from 37 CE, and I apologize, there's no open access image or no readily available image for this particular document. But what happens in this document is a man named Tryphon receives funds from his partner, his living partner, Saurios. They are cohabitating, but they are not married. And Oniphorus is mentioned as Saurius's custodian. Once again, her lord, probably her father, and everyone involved, all three persons, are illiterate. Tryphon, Saurios, and Oniphorus are all illiterate, so they have to have different people write for them. The same person can't write for them. So Leon writes a hypograph for Tryphon, Theon writes a hypograph for Oniphorus, and Didymus writes a hypograph for Saurius. So the result is then that we have 4 different hands in this document. One is the document proper, written up by the scribe, and then the 3 different hands for the 3 different persons that are writing for Tryphon, Saurius, and Oniphorus, respectively. So 3 people named in the document, 3 people writing for writing hypographs. So we've got 6 so far, and then the scribe. So 7 people involved in making this contract because the 3 people entering into the contract are all illiterate. And the opposite case of this, we can have multiple people writing in their own hand. So this is a sort of magnificent chirograph, a really, really large papyrus, or a really, really large document as far as papyrus documents go. Again, right smack dab in the middle of the 1st century. This is 5 brothers who are selling a share of their estate to their sister, and they're selling it to their sister because one of the other brothers has died. And what we find in this document is 5 different hands, all belonging to the 5 different brothers. And there's no illiteracy formulae anywhere in this document. So to zoom in on it a little bit here, you can sort of see the different hands. What they have done is they've just repeated the chirograph 5 different times. They rewrote the whole document. So the form and genre of this document did not allow for the document just to be written up and then signed by each individual. The preference was rather that each individual would rewrite the entire chirograph, because the whole document in the person's hand is what served as validation. So it was preferable if the whole thing could be written in one hand, and that one hand be the person guaranteeing the document, to show you what the validation statements look like in this document. We have the 5 different hands, one from Didymus, one from Herodes, one from Heraclides, and one from Maron. Our 5th hand, there is no validation statement. The document ends before he gets to the validation statement. It's not really clear why he doesn't make it to the validation statement, but he doesn't. And you see that the same formula is used in each case. This hand shall be valid in whatever place it might be brought, and to anyone who might bring it, though we do have some spelling variation amongst the different validation statements. And so what this indicates is that there's a preference for the entire chirograph to be written in the hand of the person that is guaranteeing it. What it also indicates is that not every validation statement, even if it was handwritten by the person creating the document or by the person mentioned in the document, they don't necessarily have to mention their name or their autograph in the validation statement. So notice here that there is no mention of the ideograph or the autograph or the "this is my hand," though we know it is each one of these individuals' hands. So even in the validation statement, if there's not an emphasis on the person's hand, the chirograph still very well might be written in the person's hand. And I would suggest that we should in fact actually assume that a chirograph is written in the debtor's own hand unless there is a hypograph or an illiteracy formula saying that someone else wrote for them, that this kind of document, a chirograph, was characteristically written in the person mentioned's own hand, that it was actually a bit of an exception, or not, maybe I should say it was not preferred that the document not be written in the person mentioned at its beginning's own hand. So our conclusions about handwriting in these kinds of documents. If the validation formula emphasizes the person's hand, the document is by rule holographic. That is to say, if the validation formula says "this is my hand" or "this is my autograph," then the entire document was by rule written in that person's own hand. The opposite side is that if there's an illiteracy formula, the validation statement by rule will not emphasize that the hand is autographic. We won't see that word ideograph, and we won't say "this is my hand," that of the person that is the debtor or the person receiving the things in the document. Though, even if the hand isn't emphasized, the document might be holographic. And so this is what our last chirograph that I showed you indicates, that you cannot have the hand be emphasized and still have the entire document be written in the hand of the debtor. And so the sort of overarching conclusion here is that there is a preference for holographs over allographs, that it is more preferable for a document to be guaranteed in the debtor's own hand than it to be guaranteed in someone else's own hand. This is not only because it's more convenient to not have to bring someone else along, but it also possessed more legal weight. Sort of as time went on, we see different sort of edicts that say more than one person have to start signing on for someone who is illiterate or for someone who does not write in their own hand for one reason or another. So rather than just having one person sign on for you, as time progresses in this genre, more people have to sign on to a hypograph. So instead of just having one, you'd have to have 2 or 3 people guaranteeing for you if you were not writing in your own hand. So a preference for holographs, that is, documents written entirely in the person's own hand, rather than allographs for this particular genre of literature. So, what of Philemon? How does all this chirographic stuff relate to Philemon? The question, is Philemon a chirograph? And the answer is no. Philemon is not a chirograph. It does not participate in this genre of literature. It is not a representative of the chirographic genre of literature. And the reason for this is that the place where we have the closest connection to this genre is in Philemon 19, where Paul claims to have written in his own hand. "I, Paul, wrote in my own hand, I will repay." So we do have some sort of echoes of the validation statement there, but we don't have a validation statement proper. This is not Paul validating Philemon as a chirograph. So the word kuria, validation, is missing altogether. We don't have any reference to Paul's autograph here. And so Philemon is not legally binding in the way that other chirographic documents might be. And Philemon 19 in particular is not a validation statement, which leads us to conclude that Philemon is not a chirograph. It is not participating in this genre of literature, though I do still suggest that chirographic preferences in inform Philemon, that Paul is sort of alluding to the rhetoric of cheirographs. And the reason that I suggest this is, one, we do have sort of some echoes of the chirographic genre with the phrase, I, Paul, write in my own hand, I will repay. This particular word, I will repay, apatisso, is a New Testament hapax. It doesn't appear anywhere else in Pauline literature or otherwise in the New Testament. And so this, combined with the emphasis on Paul's handwriting and writing in his own hand, is sort of a unique enough constellation to my mind to suggest that Paul is referring to, or is giving a nod to, this genre and this known practice of writing a chirograph in one's own hand. And so this word, apatisso, as a New Testament hapax, is frequently used in the chirographic genre, particularly for a statement that the interest will be repaid. So this sort of relates back to what Paul says just before in Philemon: if he owes you anything, if he's wronged you in any way, I will repay. I will repay the interest. I will pay sort of above and beyond. And then so this is being recalled from the genre of chirographs. And another reason that chirographic rhetoric seems to be in mind for Paul here is that the emphasis on Paul's hand comes earlier than it does in other letters. We saw this in the very, very first slide, that Paul is not just writing the greetings in his own hand. He takes up the pen before the final greetings. The question is, how much longer before? Does Paul take it up when he's just saying, I will repay, or does he take it up earlier? So we have to sort of explain why Paul is taking up the pen before the final greetings. There has to be some sort of reason why he might take up the pen before just the salutation, as he does in other letters. Because elsewhere in Pauline literature, the autographic portion is reserved for the final salutation. And so I suggest that Paul is calling attention to his own hand to evoke this trope from cheirographs, of cheirographs being written in a debtor's own hand. So while Paul does not write a full validation statement, and he doesn't do that because he's not writing a chirograph. It would have been awkward for him to write, my autographic hand, that of Paul is valid in every place it's brought, and to whomever you might bring it. That would sort of detract from the overall rhetoric of the letter of Philemon. Philemon is very much a letter. It's not a chirograph. So, but Paul recalls the genre for a particular reason. So he's sort of using the rhetoric of the chirographic genre. And I would suggest that actually writing the entire thing in his own hand sort of leverages that rhetoric better than if he were to just write a portion of it in his own hand. And the last reason to suggest that Paul has chirographic rhetoric in mind in Philemon 19 is this connection with Colossians. So Colossians 2:14 states that God crossed out or erased or destroyed the chirographs and its clauses that stood against us, and he removed it, nailing it to the cross. Of course, it is disputed whether or not Colossians is authentically Pauline, but it is of interest, and I think it actually should be a data point in considering Colossians' authenticity, that Paul mentions a chirograph here. So this is the only time the word chirograph appears in the New Testament its entirety in Pauline literature. And of course, Colossians, should it be authentic, will have been written in close proximity to Philemon, perhaps written with Philemon, sent together with Philemon to Colossae. So that could be the case that Philemon, is sort of an addendum to Colossians, attached with Colossians in order to be delivered to Philemon. And here I give you sort of the example of a chirograph that is crossed out because the debt has been repaid. So the document is no longer valid. It's been completed, and that's indicated by crossing out the clauses. So this very might be the kind of thing that Paul is referring to in this particular verse. And so my point here is that if Paul is writing Colossians and Philemon in close proximity to one another, he mentions a chirograph in Colossians and has this it makes the case or the probability stronger that he uses chirographic rhetoric in Philemon chapter 19. Sort of chirograph might be on his mind for one reason or another. Perhaps he did recently write a chirograph or something along these lines. But this sort of constellation of Colossians and Philemon both having this chirographic stuff going on suggests to me that that Paul is sort of evoking the rhetoric of the chirographic genre in Philemon 19. So, conclusions as to both chirographic genre and how it applies to the letter to Philemon. First, Paul alludes to the chirographic practice in Philemon 19, this pairing of emphasizing his own hand, and the word apatisso is enough to suggest that Paul is recalling the chirographic genre. And this allusion to the practice is strengthened if Paul follows chirographic norms. If sort of what is normal to do with a chirograph is what Paul does, it's going to strengthen his rhetoric. And the norm was for someone who was grapholiterate, to write the entire chirograph in their own hand, to write it themselves. And I firmly believe that Paul was grapholiterate, that he could and did write entire letters in his own hand, entire documents in his own hand. And so the conclusion is that Paul wrote the entirety of at least one copy of Philemon in his own hand. This is not to suggest that there was not more than one copy of Philemon made, but the sort of presentation copy, the copy that went to Philemon and the church that met in his house, was in fact entirely from the beginning to the end written in Paul's own hand.